A lot of people will say like your career doesn't make any sense, but when you zoom out, it's all about movement. It's not just how you move in the gym. It's not just how you move when you exercise. How do you move when you're in a social setting? How do you move when you are by yourself? How do you move when you are in a professional setting? We can get very focused on the thing that upset us that day or that week. There's a lot of echoes in our movement patterns across the different areas of our life.
Thanks for tuning into the Vibrant Soul Society, The Conversations. I'm your host, Baba Sam, the Miracle Man. Today we have a very bright, vibrant soul with us, Molly. Welcome, Molly, to The Conversations.
Hi, thank you so much for having me be a part of the conversation.
Who is Molly?
Great question. At my core essence, I'm a creative human, and that has been the catalyst for me all along. There are two threads that have been a part of my life that center around creativity. One is a fascination with human movement. And like when I say human movement, like, yes, dance and like fitness or any kind of those kinds of modalities, but also like social justice movements, also how like systems and how humans move through systems, even how we can like paint on a canvas. I find all of that really interesting, how we move through time and space. And I also find it fascinating what interrupts the full expression of movement. That can be stress, trauma, burnout, injury, chronic pain, all these things that get in the way of our full expression of movement. Those two threads have led to everything that I do. I have a performing arts company, Graybox Collective, and we make weird art about tough stuff. I also have a private practice as a somatic movement therapist, simply Soma Method, where the focus is on using movement as a catalyst for mental and physical well-being. Those things continue to be threads in my life.
So, what got you involved in all this? What was your spark that, oh, movement's interesting and all these aspects of movement?
Yeah, it's always been a part of my life since I can remember. So as a kid, I was nonverbal and I was in speech therapy by the time I was 2 years old and continued in speech therapy until late in grade school, at least. And I think because voice was something difficult for me and speaking was difficult and I was painfully shy. Like my parents had to still order for me at a restaurant even when I was a teenager. Voice hasn't been my thing in that avoidance of engaging with voice. That's part of where the movement came along. And nonverbal communication was huge for me and something that I've always been drawn to. It wasn't until more recently when I was trying to like reflecting on life and how did we end up where we are kind of a thing, minor existential crisis. And I was looking back because a lot of people will say like your career doesn't make any sense. But when you zoom out, it's all about movement. I was an academic advisor. I was a curriculum coordinator, which is all about how students move through a degree. How do they move through a program? How do we scaffold our learning? All of that is still movement to me. So even though it might like the title might look like it's not movement, it's still there for me. So yeah, it started very young.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Most people are not thinking about how they are moving through time and space and what interrupts that flow of movement. That is really deep and profound to step back and examine, like, why are we doing what we do?
And I think we exercise. That's our movement. Movement is something that is contained, but even like, how do you move through your kitchen? How do you move through the grocery store? All of those things I find really fascinating. And even with clients, like we'll start to connect dots with how they move through work relationships, friendships, family relationships. All of that is we're still the same vessel moving in those ways. And so those movements start to become a part of us.
Right, because life is really like a river. We're constantly moving, and who throws the logs into the river that interrupt the flow of life? So that's really an interesting analogy that I don't think many people have really stepped back and really examined that.
I appreciate that you bring up a river, right? Because I think there are times, right, the river is nice and smooth and then there are times that river is real bumpy, and we might be up against the banks of the river. So yeah, I appreciate being in flow doesn't always mean that it's a smooth ride.
Life is like a river, and sometimes we try to dam up the river, and it creates all sorts of problems because we're not getting into that flow of life. How do you help people to step into their flow?
Yeah. So it's interesting that you bring up like damming up a river. A lot of the work I do is around the nervous system, and I talk about the nervous system like a bottle of soda, and we all carry it around, right? And it's this container, and life is bumpy, right? So it starts to get shaken up. And sometimes we don't know that we're carrying around a bottle of soda, and sometimes we don't know how long that bottle of soda has been shaken up. And so a lot of it's bringing awareness to that so that we can like slowly start to release that pressure that's been built up within us, as opposed to like suddenly opening the bottle of soda, not knowing that it is going to explode everywhere. It becomes a whole nother mess to take care of. So that's one way to start to engage is like, how can we start to understand how to release a little bit of pressure on a regular basis because we are building that within ourselves in really subtle ways.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people are quite volatile. They don't realize that their cap is really screwed on tight and they're not releasing that pressure and they get into this disruptive flow that's not beneficial to them.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times in our society, we talk about like the really big, obvious events that, like, yes, that's a trauma and no one's really going to argue with you. But we don't talk about the subtle things where we have to keep adapting just a little bit to suddenly we're like a complete 180 of ourselves. We're like, hold up, this is not who I am or what I believe in, or I feel like I'm completely out of alignment with myself. How'd I get here? And it's all those little moments that really add up.
Once again, people are not realizing how they got to a certain point in life. They're pretty much riding the waves and not knowing they're riding the waves of life.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that self-awareness or whatever that moment is where suddenly we're like, whoa, this isn't what like I thought I signed up for. I think those are the moments where I tend to come into contact with clients, especially where they've been trying to, go to various therapeutic models or go to medical doctors or whatever it is, and they're just getting stuck a little bit. How can we start to get some movement back in that stuckness?
That would really have helped me out. It took me 38 years before I got unstuck because I didn't realize I was stuck. And I think
Mhm,
that's what people don't realize they are stuck, that they are not moving, that they're not living their life, that they're riding someone else's wave on how
mhm.
they're supposed to ride the wave.
Yes. Yeah. Right. And we get that, I think, so much in our lives. That's the messaging, that's the conditioning that we just kind of go into these default modes without pausing long enough to be like, is this actually the journey I want to be on? Yeah.
How do you get people to snap out of it, to become self-aware? Oh, life doesn't have to be this way?
I mean, that is a journey in and of itself. And I think with the work that we create in Graybox Collective, I talk a lot about like gently shaking people because I'm not for a big cathartic moment. I think because like those subtleties that we were just talking about, I think we need that same kind of subtlety to bring us back. We do hit like kind of a wall or something that allows us to bounce back. I think there's just like following impulses can be such a huge thing of where you see something that just happens to come across your path. Someone happens to mention something to you and it draws you in. And the default mode, people just are like, okay, yeah, sure. But like underneath it, I trust that there's something else going on. I do a lot of trainings on trauma informed creative practices and the intersection of trauma and creativity. And more often than not in those trainings, people say like, yeah, I've never done any training around this. But then when we start to dig into it, they're like, oh, I have done that. Oh, I've done that too. Oh, I already do that. And I think there's just something like there's something in there already on a subconscious, unconscious level that we just got to let it rise to the surface because it's there.
Right, I thought that was interesting is something comes across your path, and sometimes you see that and you're like, "Oh, what's this all about?" And you start diving in that we get this avenue to really open up. And for me, that was a paranormal experience I couldn't explain. Like,
Yeah.
that got me curious. Oh, there's something more than I can see with my eyes.
I love that because I think there's so much happening in our lives that we just can't touch, we can't see. How can we start to bring that awareness in or see it in some felt sense within us can make a huge change.
So it's really interesting when you talked before about the Graybox Collective that you're usually talking about things that are, well, I forget the exact wording that you used on that.
Yeah.
That it
Yeah.
was outside the norm, like difficult
Yes.
circumstances.
So with Graybox Collective, we make weird art about tough stuff.
That's it. Tough stuff.
Tough stuff. And by weird, I mean like it is abstract, it's non-linear, it is you're not coming to see like a Shakespearean play or anything. You're not going to see the Nutcracker under our productions. And tough stuff is also based on our perception, right? Of what it might be difficult for me to talk about, might not be difficult for you to talk about. We tend to talk about the things that most people are not used to just diving into conversations about.
It reminds me of the Philadelphia Fringe Festival with all
Yeah.
these performances. Yes, when I
Yeah.
was attending those, absolutely about the tough
Yeah.
stuff that we don't want to talk about until you present it to them in a way that they can relate to and say, okay, we can talk about this.
I think so much of this work, whether it's what I'm doing with clients one on one or within the performing arts, it's being able to walk with people into it. And how can we walk into these difficult conversations, or how can we walk into things that we've been avoiding, patterns that we need to break without it feeling overwhelming, right? Because I think that can also result in its own kind of moment that isn't so great. It could be traumatizing. It could be overwhelming. It could like just result in us not being able to cope with something. And so we shut it down out of protection. So how can we walk with people into these conversations and stay in connection with them in a way that allows us to continue to dive a little deeper without it feeling like something we want to run away from?
Running away is so common. It's just that way it is. But I want to go back a little. I'm just curious if you look back at your older self now as nonverbal, very shy, what would you say to your younger self now that you have this training, this understanding about how life moves?
Yeah. Oh, what a great question. So I think it's interesting because there's something about who I was then and who I am now. It's very much the same. I'm all about the visual arts. I'm all about dance and movement. There's just so much more depth to it. And I think there's this like healthy downward spiral journey that we can go on that's just deepening. And I feel like that kind of is my entire life is this idea of returning to myself, returning to who I was. And those nonverbal moments now are much more about tending to and taking care of myself as opposed to previously where it was about putting up those walls and that was a way to protect myself, right? And not being able to express myself in certain ways. So, yeah, I think it's more about telling my younger self, telling my past self about trusting the process of returning to who you are.
That's very important. A lot of people aren't returning to who they are. They're adding more stories or adding more debris to the river. If we're going to the river analogy, they're adding
Yeah.
more debris. They're not returning home to self. So that's really an interesting aspect as well. So, what's the basic way that you're getting people to return home that are not self aware? Do you have like practices, exercises to get in tune?
Yeah. So, yes, I mean, the root of a lot of the work that I do is in somatic inquiry. So, how can we go through some kind of a phrase or some kind of a task and just tune into what's happening within us? And what are the stories that are coming up? I love like somatic storytelling, right? Because our brain's going to take whatever information's coming up from the body and then impose a story. I talk about how our mind body connection. We like sometimes we play telephone with ourselves, like that game as a kid, right? Where like the it starts with the word like ostrich and ends with the word like rhinoceros somehow. I think we do that within ourselves, with our brain and our bodies. And so it's a lot about clearing up that communication within ourselves. A task that I do sometimes is with like little blocks from the game Jenga, those little wooden blocks. And it's really the task is that you balance those blocks and you move through the room. Uh, but then the stories start to come almost immediately. Like, what happens if I drop a block? Like, oh, I'm a bad person. Oh, I broke the rules. Oh my goodness, I'm going to damage something. Like, that's where we can start to just within us in really quiet ways. Uh, but I love putting it in something outside of ourselves, something task based, because our body's going to organize very naturally when we start to bring our focus out in that way.
That's important work that clear our conversations because we're not even aware that we're having a conversation with ourselves. And our body takes that as, okay, we will do this. And it's not in your best interest. You get yourself really stressed out, anxious, worried because of that story that you're telling yourself that you
Yeah.
believe it's your truth.
Yes.
And we're not really clearing those up. Because
Hmm.
even when I was in therapy for a long time, when I was a bipolar, they were constantly reframing thoughts. And I later get to see that we're chasing thoughts with more thought. We're not cleaning up the communication. We're just adding more thoughts to the
Yes.
process.
More debris, like you were saying. Like, yeah, like it is cluttered in there. Yeah. And I think there's something once we start to bring awareness to what those thoughts are, like a common one is that we get in our own way, right? Whether it's self sabotage or what have you, getting in our own way in some way. And that's going to show up in our movement patterns as well. So maybe we start with the block activity and we see how we're getting in our own way with that activity. And then we can start to focus more specifically on like, okay, well, let's see how can we start to explore what getting in our own way looks like as a movement pattern in our body.
Hmm. That's interesting. You get me to think about things in a different way that I not normally seeing that because I guess you grew up in a nonverbal world. So you're seeing things very movement and structure, the organization of movement. And most people are not in that space. So to me, it's just fascinating.
Yeah. And it's something like, right, fish don't know the water that they swim in, kind of the same for me. It's been in the past probably 5 years that I'm starting to understand more like, oh, not everyone's picking up on all the information that I'm picking up on. Like, cool. That's very different conversations that I receive sometimes.
Yeah, because it's a world you don't think about. It's like somebody that doesn't hear, they have a different world, and somebody that doesn't see the different world, and it's just a different perspective.
Yeah.
And it's nice that you can mirror that back to people that you might be picking up singles that they're not even aware of, that you're moving through life this way because of some programming,
Yes.
some way of being that's not serving them. And I like to call this debris, the head trash that we're getting in our
Yeah.
own way.
And I've definitely like gotten myself into some like funky situations where someone's like, I don't know, I do this all the time. And I was like, oh, well, here's what's happening in your body when you said that. And then I went into like details of how their spine moved. And they're like, that's not what I meant. And I was like, whoop, okay, sorry. Like, cool. Well, that happened. But okay, you tell me your version, right? Your narrative.
But you're probably both accurate as well. They just didn't have that perception that they were moving their spine a certain way or doing a certain thing, but they
Yeah.
didn't have that awareness to see that's what they were doing.
Yeah, definitely. And I find that's often even like within my own personal journey, but also with others, it's like, okay, where's that resistance? And if we're not ready to see it, then like, okay, we're not ready to see it. We can tuck that away for another day. And at like just the right moment, right? We get to pull that out again. Be like, remember that time when your spine moved like this? And then we can have that conversation.
Right. Yeah. So it's really fascinating how you're working with people, get them to see what isn't seen. It's really going to get me thinking now about how am I moving through life? Am I interrupting my own natural flow?
There have been times I've been in groups where, like, I was a community, right? Like, I was a peer in that group, and I said something about, like, "Oh, our posture," and, like, I can just see out of the periphery, like, everyone kind of adjusts in the space. It's something that I'm soaking up at all times.
What's these trauma informed creative practices that you do? Because we're all dealing with lots of trauma that is unprocessed, it's still sticking around. So, what are some of these practices that you're talking about?
I'll zoom out for a moment on trauma-informed creative practices. It's technically something I've done since 2007, but I didn't have this language around it to about 2018, and it is a framework that comes out how I have created performances for the past 15 plus years. In 2007, when I was first creating performances, I started just by happenstance. I needed to combine my studies in dance and theater with a mission of an office on that campus to raise awareness about sexual assault. And so I was tasked at the age of 20 with like, okay, go make a show about like raising awareness about sexual violence on college campuses. And at that time, like no one was talking about trauma really. The Me Too movement wasn't a thing. There wasn't a lot out there. And so I just bumbled my way through developing this performance from scratch. And I saw in the performers how that show really impacted them. Like it got into them in a way that other choreography or directorial kind of things didn't. And there was one moment, I think it was the final dress rehearsal, people started sharing how their dreams had been impacted. And whatever role they were in the show started to become a part of their dreams. So even like someone who was a bystander in the show was having dreams where he would reach out to help someone and his hands would turn to sand. And it was in that moment where I started questioning, like, okay, how can we produce necessary, important work that addresses difficult topics without harming the people who are creating that work? And so that kickstarted the whole trauma-informed creative practices journey. And it's a framework of how to engage in developing difficult art without hurting the people that are creating it. As a framework, yes, it was definitely born out of the devised theater practice. However, I've also used it when I was a professor. It was part of my pedagogy in work with clients one-on-one. I still use that framework. I find it very helpful in kind of going back to what I was saying about like walking people into those difficult conversations. That framework is what allows me to do that.
That was definitely tough stuff you were dealing there. Sexual trauma, that's very tough stuff. So that really
Yeah.
was probably pivotal in your moment. Like, where can I create this and express it and getting to the world? And then be an actor to do that, not be impacted by that as well.
Yeah. And I think like it's kind of inevitable that we're going to be impacted by it. We're humans, and hopefully we can sense that humanity and understand it on an embodied level, but how can it not become a part of us? And how can we make sure that we are releasing it? The vicarious or secondary trauma that can come up is very real. And that's part of what it addresses.
That's very interesting. So I'm just really curious with your work. Like, if I came to you as a client, I'm dealing with MS, I can't walk, I'm dealing with all these issues. Where do you begin to get me back into me?
I love taking like a really wide inventory of people's journeys. Some of the nonverbal coming up for me. I also find it really interesting what movement language comes up in the way people talk about why they're coming to talk to me. I've been trying to push through this. Oh, I've been trying to, get my head on straight. And it's like, okay, cool. I'm noticing like some push language come up. So that's going to be upper body. We're going to start to explore what you do with your upper body. Get your head on straight. Like, okay, cool. We're going to start to look at like neck and shoulders and what's happening around the skull and the face. So I ask about the journey, and that's where I get to gather all these clues as to where we would begin.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, getting clues because it's a long life journey and they got all these little nuances that you were talking about before that most people don't have that awareness that you see things so differently from other people that I've talked to.
Yeah. I had one client who said in that first session, we were able to connect so many dots that like she'd been in months of therapy and not connected those dots. Because in therapy, and I have found this for myself as well, right? We can get very focused on the thing that upset us that day or that week. And when we zoom in, I think that's important, but also what happens when we like start to look at like, well, actually that thing that upset you there is the exact same movement pattern that upset you in that relationship you just got out of, or that thing that upset you in your home, or whatever other things might be coming up. But there's a lot of echoes in our movement patterns across the different areas of our life.
That's a good way to put it, echoes, because the mind's always in this loop and it's just doing different echoes of the same thing. And that's what I found through therapy and my own personal journey was we're just digging up old stuff. We're just digging up more debris, and it's getting very cluttered here. How do we get rid of all of this?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And that's one thing in Graybox, we have like a manifesto that we've been reading out more often. And part of what it talks about is that we don't have to actually talk about the tough stuff, which, right, like with kind of counterintuitive of like, well, hold up. I thought we were supposed to be here to spark conversations. Like, yes, but it's amazing what you can spark without going directly into it or without going into all the depth and the details. And just trusting those stories are there. If we have a show about sexual violence, my guess is the reason people are in the audience is because sexual violence has impacted them. I don't need to know everyone's story in the audience to believe that they're there for a reason.
So where do you normally perform like the Graybox Collective? Where does that usually fall into, like here off Broadway?
Yes, we're definitely in more of that like fringe world. We've done Boulder Fringe Festival before, uh, and non-traditional spaces. Like I love finding like the a vacant warehouse. I think, gosh, the list of places we performed, like empty bars. We were in one farmers market that actually used to be a golf course. Um, Definitely, our venues are very non-traditional, just as in the work we create and how we create it.
Well, I guess it's part of a purpose too, because you're dealing with tough stuff. So you create the scenario. The scene is the tough stuff that you don't have to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. And there's also permission to not go into all the details as well, because it's a lot. Even if we're just focused on, say, sexual violence, like that is going to get into mental health, that is going to get into grief and loss, that is going to get into all these other human experiences. Really honoring, like, how can we do this in a way where it can still be received, right? With client work as well, right? Not wanting to dive in too deep and go to that cathartic experience because it might shut us down. And then what are we going to do if we're in a shutdown state? Working backwards.
I'm just totally fascinated with this non-traditional approach. This is completely new territory for me that I never considered all this movement stuff that I never thought about before.
I'm excited that it's kind of opening up some new perspectives.
It's a whole new perspective. That's what I was hoping to do with the conversation. Other traditional spiritual podcast, holistic health. No, we're also talking about movement that we're not even thinking about. And
Yeah.
I always tell people that we're not even aware that we're sitting in a chair, that we're listening, that we're not here.
Yeah. We get into these routines. I think one thing that I try to balance in my life and in rehearsals or with clients is that balance of novelty and routine. Because I think once we kind of get into this absent-minded routine, we do lose touch with ourselves. Because why do we need to pay attention anymore, right? But then also, like, too much novelty can also be overwhelming if, like, every experience is brand new. So how can we start to find those containers that allow for both to happen?
Mm, fascinating. Do you have any one last nugget of advice you would give to individuals listening to this conversation?
Coming back to noticing how you're moving through life. And it's not just how you move in the gym, it's not just how you move when you exercise. How do you move when you're in a social setting? How do you move when you are by yourself? How do you move when you are in a professional setting? And the movement doesn't have to be big or grand. It can be really subtle of like the shape of your spine, or do you lean a certain way? Noticing all of that and just letting that be an inventory that you can get curious about.
And I think it was also important when you would mention too, what is interrupting that flow as well from the routine?
Yeah. Especially if you start to compare and contrast when you're like in a workspace, how are you moving versus like when you're alone? My guess is there are some differences in those movement patterns.
Well, thank you, Molly. It's been great to have you on the conversation. I appreciate your insights, your wisdom. You got me a whole new reality that I'll be start to explore.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you again for creating this space and inviting me into it. I appreciate it.